ideally we have several, it's not one conversation, but it's starting the conversation that we have multiple times in order to figure out what is the best path for all parties involved.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm excited today to be joined by somebody that I met at an event. He was a keynote speaker, and I really resonated with everything that he was teaching. He is an expert when it comes to the complicated, sometimes messy, sometimes amazing relationship that most of us have in our business, the co-founder relationship. He has a background in clinical psychology, couples therapies, worked with companies all over the world, backed by Y Combinator, Sequoia, Google Ventures, and is the founder of Co-Founder Clarity, and also the author of a brand new book that you should check out in the show notes called The Co-Founder Effect. So with all of that, Dr. Matthew Jones, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about all things co-founder related.
I am excited about this too, because it is one of the most important relationships that we have in our lives. And so it's one that can have a tremendous impact on the business and also just like on how we feel every day going to work. So I'm excited to dive into this topic. But before I do, I've given everyone a little taste of what you do, Matt, but in your own words, what do you do and who do you serve?
Sure. So my background is in clinical psychology, and I was getting my doctorate, and while I was going down this deep rabbit hole into non-dual awareness and spirituality and psychodynamic therapy and all these other really neat, fascinating topics, two of my closest friends started a company together. And so I watched them grow it into a multi-million-dollar success externally. But as you know, internally, it can be a little bit of a different story. And so they were doing a lot of venting to me about some of their frustrations with one another. And because they were both friends, at a certain point, I said, look, guys, the problem's not internal. It's interpersonal. So we need to sit down and have a group conversation. And they ended up finding that immensely valuable. And so you fast forward a few years and they said, Matt, you not only saved our business, you saved our friendship. And so that was the moment that for me, I had this insight of, wait, all the different tools and frameworks we have in couples therapy and systems theories, that there's many of those that apply to this relationship between co-founders and business partners. And this relationship is the most important relationship in business. Why are there not more people doing this and working on this? And so that's what got me instantly hooked.
Yeah. It's funny because I've asked myself that same question. Even just like finding a therapist that really understands business and entrepreneurship, it's like not an easy thing to do. And so to be able to find a person that is an expert in really managing this particular relationship, I think is pretty cool. So with all of that, let's start with the key kind of problem. Why is this relationship so challenging? And what are some of the common symptoms that you see bubble up that might tell someone that's listening that they might need to pay a little bit of a closer attention to the relationship they have with their partners in the business?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of walk through a few different thoughts here. I was just taking a note that part of what makes this uniquely challenging is there's a lot of coaches who have operational experience but lack some of the psychological training to go in depth on the interpersonal dynamics piece. And so you'll find coaches who can help from a business lens, but not kind of that psychological emotional lens. You also have therapists, to your point, who lack, like using therapeutic language, lack cultural competence to work with entrepreneurs and founders. They don't actually understand business or the reality of what that looks like. And so they might get some of the interpersonal pieces, but totally miss the business. And in my opinion, good co-founder coaching does both simultaneously. We have to both address some of those interpersonal complexities and create actual structural changes at times in roles and responsibilities, equity and compensation, whatever the case may be in the business. And if we don't do either of those things, it's a disservice to the people in the organization. And so I bring that up because I think part of the challenge here is acknowledging how complex this relationship really is, that it's simultaneously the thing that if you get right will lead to a multiplying effect where, execution gets easier. Every single day you feel that sense of we're on the same team, a lot of momentum. And simultaneously, like if it's not managed well, you'll be up at night thinking more about that than your product. And so in that way, it can be a real direct threat to bottom line. And so I think part of what's so important is to think a lot more about the ways in which this relationship needs care and prioritization from the beginning. And so I know you also mentioned signs and symptoms, but I think I'll just take a breath here and let you chime back in.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, all like really important points to bring up in that there's so much complexity to this relationship. And to tie all of that together, there's often a very complex relationship between an individual and their business. As an entrepreneur, I can say with a lot of certainty that no matter how much time I spend in therapy trying to separate my identity and my feelings from the business, it is not an easy thing to do on a day-to-day basis, especially when stress ramps up and, things are going on in the busyness of the day-to-day. That's not necessarily something that everybody's able to do. And so that, really adds fuel to the fire. And it can be a very emotional thing to have challenges in the business and then have, this person that you're supposed to be solving these challenges with not necessarily be on the same page. And so with all of that, if someone's listening, what are some signs that their co-founder or partnerships, inside the business, that those relationships need maybe a little bit of tending to, or are not as optimal as they should be?
100%. I think the biggest red flag that everyone should pay attention to is recurring disagreements. So what I often see in teams is we might have several different topics that we're disagreeing about. It could be roles and responsibilities, equity and compensation, could be hiring and firing and kind of personnel management. It can be like during certain phases of company growth, either like slow growth and we're all really frustrated with one another, or high growth and we're going through a lot of developmental changes, going from like IC to leadership and management, et cetera. And so it can take many different forms, but the thing that I see consistently is that teams get stuck, and whenever they're stuck on a recurring disagreement, that's whenever it starts to escalate, where it's not about the actual content level that you're disagreeing about. It's often about some unspoken emotional dynamic that if you're able to surface and identify, it'll help you make the business decision 10 times faster, because usually there's something else going on. And so whether that's, an argument about like care and closeness, like I want a little bit more interpersonal distance, I feel like you're micromanaging me, or something about the power dynamic and how that's distributed in decision-making authority, or something like feeling like your contribution's not being seen or recognized and appreciated in the way that you want. Whatever those deeper conversations are, that's what I really want teams to be able to identify, ideally.
It's interesting because there's this this interesting balance where in some ways you could say evidence of a strong and healthy relationship between co-founders is the ability to really disagree with each other and really challenge each other's ideas and, approach a problem from very different perspectives, and then be able to come to consensus or disagree and commit to a direction anyway. But to your point, recurring disagreements, especially those that become emotional, I think that's an interesting sign. Some things from personal experience that I think are worth noting here as well would be like hesitation to challenge the co-founder. And this is true about, I think, lots of other people on the team over time. When I found myself thinking, I don't know if I want to bring this up to them, or I don't know if I want to challenge this on this because I'm anticipating an emotional reaction, like that's a red flag for me. That's like, okay, there's something here that needs to get worked through or addressed. Another thing is just sort of like general fear of challenging or rubbing this person in the wrong way is, something that I've had to become really sensitive to over time. And so those are some things that I would sort of append from my personal experience. I'm curious if that lines up to your point of view.
100%. And I really appreciate those additions. It's got me thinking a little bit about trust, because part of what I'm hearing is I don't trust that if I raise this issue with you that you're going to respond appropriately, or whatever variant that might take. And as I think about trust, just to throw this out, I view it as like two different parts. There's operational trust, which is I trust your professional competence, your ability to do the job and to manage the task, shared definition of done, whatever the case may be, or personal trust. I trust that you will show up and be responsive and attuned and available whenever I need you. And part of what you might be getting at is on either side, or perhaps both, there could be a little bit of rupture if you find yourself being unwilling to give difficult feedback, or, kind of cowering away from sharing your full opinion due to the emotional repercussions, it's to me a sign that there's already some trust that needs to be looked at.
Yeah. So, with all this being said, assuming there's some people listening that have relationships with their partners that could be better, or are just like looking to find ways to continually improve a relationship that's already healthy, what is your sort of core framework for how to approach building a healthy relationship and maintaining that over time?
So I've created the co-founder satisfaction index as a brief tool to help us identify some of the strengths and weaknesses of the partnership, just for easy low level alignment. That's a tool that I have available for free. And so if you and your co-founder both take it, you'll have like certain output scores that you can compare and contrast. And then if you want more detail for the item level specifics about areas of alignment and misalignment between the two of you, just let me know, email me, and I'm happy to share those results and create a custom report. But at a high level, I think the main mechanism, the main framework that I've created is called the co-founder conflict navigation system. And it's a 3-phase process that goes really in depth, walking you through exactly how to prepare for conversations, doing those self-reflective exercises beforehand, and then actually how to have that conflict conversation to make sure that it goes as effectively as possible. And then what to do afterwards to make sure that there's systems of accountability to make sure that you guys can continue growing as a team. And so that's stuff that I go really far into detail in the book that I think if you're interested would be really valuable. The one piece that I want to share with you is just the lowest hanging fruit that I see that does work regardless of team stage or scale is doing co-founder syncs and dates. So syncs are what you're probably already doing. Syncs are those rapid kind of operational focused updates about the happenings in the business. This is where you're talking through current issues or whatever the case may be and making sure that you're aligned on priorities. This is something that a lot of teams do already relatively well. I think there's room to be more explicit. And this is something that what I recommend doing is scheduling. So whether that's at the end of each day, end of each week, building in time to make sure that you guys are on the same page from a business perspective. I think that's super valuable. And the reason I bring this up and that it doesn't go fully without saying is I see a lot of early stage teams where they don't schedule this time and it just kind of like happens kind of ad hoc and kind of throughout the day. And I think that's actually a great way to disrupt deep work time and creates other inefficiencies. So this is one. The second piece, the co-founder dates, is creating intentional time and space to engage in meta communication. So that's thinking about how you and your co-founder are talking, are working together, are making decisions. And so you're taking a little bit of a step back to not just be in the relationship and reactive to it, but working on it. Right. So that way you and your co-founder are sitting there. And the main question to ask is, how are we doing? Right? Like, how are we performing? How are we operating? How are we making decisions? And that's then the gateway to give and receive feedback more effectively. And so if you're able to do that, what I see teams do it, who do it successfully is either scheduling that block of time, could be an hour, could be a 90-minute, 2-hour, whatever the case may be. And sometimes that's as often as once a week or as infrequent as once a quarter. But making sure that you do that and you're doing an activity together outside of work where you can just connect as human beings and you can kind of see the person behind the facade, so to speak. Because I think sometimes when we're locked down and a lot's coming at us, we might be trying to push through a difficult time. We start to reduce the complexity of the other person. And so this is a nice way to humanize them and to then reconnect as a team while making sure that you guys are committed to working on the relationship.
Yeah. You raise, I think, some really good points there. And it's funny, this was something that my co-founder and I were very intentional about, was the scheduling the syncs every week. To your point, like, that's protected time. It doesn't move. We rarely ever missed it. And then around the dates, that was something that we would do on a quarterly basis, but could probably stand to do more often. And I think the thing that you've touched on here is like intentional time for clearing conversations, right? So it's like, that this is like, you've created a frame for providing feedback. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think that's a really important thing for us to dig into, is like, especially where there's maybe some apprehension or there's some tension in the relationship, how do you facilitate a clearing conversation or a giving and receiving of feedback in a way that sets it up for the highest likelihood of success?
Sure. There's a few different components, I think, whenever it comes to like these kind of clearing conversations you're talking about. One high level framework that I think is important to mention, and then I'll try to go into the main piece here, is just the idea of containment. So how do we contain a conflict so that it doesn't contaminate our execution? One way that we do that is we schedule that time. To your point. And so tactically, just to give you a really specific example of what this can look like, let's say my co-founder Mark and I are, in an all hands meeting. He interrupts me 3 different times, and at the most core to my being, I feel really deeply hurt that he did this. But of course, I'm not going to get there yet. I'm just angry. I'm just frustrated that Mark interrupted me these 3 times. If I were kind of flying off the handle and not really containing conflict, I could say something like, Mark, like, dude, why are you such an asshole? You totally don't care what I have to say. It's so frustrating. I can't believe you did this, whatever the case may be. That, as you know, is going to provoke Mark to be in a very defensive position where he has to kind of justify and defend himself, etc. Whereas if I were to contain this conflict, what I would say is, hey, Mark, listen, I'm noticing that I'm having some reactions to the all hands meeting. Would love it if we could just kind of debug and realign. Are you open Friday at 2 p.m.? And so what I just did is I contained the conflict. I gave it a specific time. I gave it a kind of a topic. And so he knows based on my language that, okay, Matt has some kind of reaction to what happened. I don't know. Maybe I'll reflect on it. And he wants to talk about it, make sure that we're realigned. Okay, great. And so then there's a little bit more buy-in. And then the two of us, from the very beginning, have a better likelihood of success than just in the moment being more reactive. Or on the flip side, I'll just say this and then would love to hear your thoughts, or avoiding it altogether, of saying like, ooh, like this didn't feel good, but actually I'm not going to say anything because that creates some secondary effects we can talk more about too.
Yeah. It's funny because we have a system at Parakeeto for providing peer feedback, and it follows these same principles where it's like you have to reach out to the person and say, is this a good time for me to give you some feedback? And they're allowed to say no, like if their dog just died this morning and maybe you weren't aware of that, like maybe it's not a good time. And if they say yes, we actually start by writing the feedback out. And we see that as a really important exercise because like to write the feedback, it forces you to like be more thoughtful, and it often comes out a lot more thoughtful as you write it out. And we cover basically like 3 things. What's the situation? What was the behavior that triggered a certain reaction, and then what was the impact that it had on me and my perception of that? That gets sent over. The person has a chance to read and review it, and then there's a meeting and conversation. And this is partly because we're an asynchronous company, so we're very militant about like everything, as much as possible we should try to do everything in like a written asynchronous format. But I found that has helped us show up to the conversation like so much more primed for it to be productive and with some mutual understanding, having processed a lot of sort of like the initial emotions around something, and has led to like far better results. And I think the key thing here, to your point, is like it contains the conflict and puts some rails around it and creates a frame so that everyone's sort of prepared to have that discussion.
I love that. And it sounds so intentional and could be really helpful because not only does it help you be really clear and specific, and I noticed you mentioned the situation, the behavior, and the impact. That sets you up then to give that feedback in a far more effective manner because you're sticking to the shared observable reality, those behaviors. You're also naming the impact, how you're impacted. And what you're not doing is saying, again, to use my horrible example, like, Mark, you don't care what I have to say. You're an asshole, right? What I'm doing is name calling and crossing the net, making all these assumptions about Mark's intent. Instead, what you're saying is what we find most effective is to say something like, hey, Mark, I felt really hurt and frustrated when you interrupted me those 3 times during the all hands meeting. And what I really want is for us to present a united front to the company. Are you open to syncing beforehand, before the next one, to make sure that we're on the same page? Is that kind of like what this kind of guides you towards?
I mean, that's the intended outcome, right? Is that at the end of receiving that document, that person, is able to agree to a meeting or respond to it. Like they'll sort of, the ball's in their court in terms of how to move it forward. But that would be the goal, right? Is to like have some mutual understanding, and then have the clearing conversation from that place. So this kind of gets us into the actual clearing conversation. And you've touched on a couple of important elements there, but what do you think is your framework for having a productive conversation when it comes time to do that?
I think it really varies based on the level of emotional intensity. And so there's some conversations where, like, I'm kind of taking your example here, where I think there's already been some pre-work. There's already been, like you said, kind of a priming. The other person's not going to just be blindsided, so to speak. So chances are that's already eliminated a lot of the emotional intensity. It's already kind of mitigated some of those factors, which means you can hit the ground running, again, staying true to best practice of using the I message, like what I was trying to model a second ago, as opposed to crossing the net and making those statements where you're assuming the person's intent. And so I think that can be just really healthy and effective. And then what I would say on the listener's end is really doing as much of a good job as you can to listen with the intent of helping the other person feel heard and understood, as opposed to just listening to respond. And so that requires managing your own psychology a bit. But I think if you're able to do that, then that can be enough for kind of low level friction. On the other hand, for teams, and this is something, I wanted to mention earlier, and I'll just kind of weave it in now, the co-founder relationship is at the root a attachment-based relationship, meaning you want the person to be available, responsive, kind of engaged. And if and when they're not, that can be exceptionally frustrating. Like your primal fear response can really kick in, because it feels like, well, I can't rely on you personally or professionally. And so then, my livelihood, my identity, they're all being threatened. And I bring that up because when these conflicts start to escalate, especially if there's been emotional debt, all those small moments where you didn't speak up and it's accumulated in the background and led to some resentment, then it can lead to two or more people feeling really heated simultaneously. In which case, that's whenever I really recommend a framework called reflective dialogue. And what this does, much like kind of your written protocol, is it slows things down to make sure that we're in our prefrontal cortex. We're not getting overridden by the emotions of our limbic system. And it, again, aims to help people feel heard and understood. And it does that through one primary mechanism, which is dividing the conversation into a speaker and a receiver. So the speaker is the person who's going to be using those I messages, all the best practices we talked about. And then the person who's listening, the receiver, is going to be focused on listening to help the other person feel understood. And their main job, they kind of have two and a half jobs. One is to, take some notes and then reflect back what they heard. So kind of a paraphrase. So I heard you say X, Y, Z. Did I get that right? Or is there more you'd like to add? And once they do that, the other person's like, okay, like you at least heard the words. And then ideally, then you can go deeper. This is the second half of your job, is then to validate a little bit. So like, that makes sense from your perspective. I could totally see that, or a statement of empathy or that kind of a thing. And so that's what I recommend for teams whenever there's higher levels of tension.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. So that kind of gets us to the clearing conversation. Then you mentioned like what happens after, right? So let's assume you go in, both parties are able to sort of get their perspective out. There's some amount of mutual understanding on each person's perspective. How do you then translate that into a path forward that's going to help mend the relationship and get things on the right track?
I think this is one that just in transparency is a little bit more tricky. And I think context really matters here. But what I'd say in general is, to me, an ideal outcome of one of these conflict conversations or clearing conversation is, and this is the ideal, and then we'll kind of work off of it. Ideally, we both feel a little bit less emotionally reactive. We feel heard, seen, understood, etc. And then there's a clear plan, action items, whatever the case may be, that we agree to. And then we follow up about it afterwards. And so what I find to be really important is, and this is leaning into like the buzzwords of ownership and accountability and kind of growth mindset, but really leaning in and saying like, okay, like if I perceive this feedback to be valid and important, or even if I don't, and yet the impact was so negative, what commitments can I make to the other person to ensure that this doesn't happen again, even if this was not my intention, because there's a big difference between what we intend and the impact on the other person. And so we can always acknowledge impact, and then work to do anything that we can to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And so I would like to be really clear in this meeting, and especially afterwards of, okay, here's what I'm committing to do. And then let's put a timeline to follow back up. Because I think if we don't follow back up, it's just like an open loop that the other person's probably thinking about. And so to kind of, I heard a CEO once say the biggest gift you can give someone is closing open loops. And I think there's something to that, because it shows you, hey, look, that commitment that I made you, I took it seriously. I understand your feedback. I care about you. And so here, let's talk about it again and see if I've made the adjustment. And so I think if you can do some of those features, then you're moving in the positive direction.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, it's try to come to a mutual agreement on what to do moving forward. Ideally, something that each person can commit to, or at least one person can commit to, and then set some kind of a date to follow up on that conversation, follow up on those commitments, and see how each person's feeling about it as the general framework.
100%.
Yeah. Amazing. So before we move on, I want to talk about an important thing, and it's a bit of a personal anecdote, which is when co-founder relationships come to an end. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that can happen. And some of those severing of the relationships, they go really well and they go amicably, and there's a lot of business to work through often in those transitions. And other times they devolve into a really negative experience. And I know people that have gone through both of those things. Personally, I just went through a air quotes breakup recently with a business partner in our own business at Parakeeto. And thankfully it went really well, super amicable, still have a great relationship. I think it's testament to the strength of the relationship that we had going into that separation. And, also testament to the ability for us to have clear conversations where, we had reached a point where it was no longer tenable for us to continue to work together in the business. And we felt comfortable enough to have that conversation. In particular, my co-founder felt comfortable enough to raise that issue. So I feel very grateful that it went well, but not everybody has that experience. And so if a co-founder relationship might be coming to an end, what advice do you have for people on how to try to set that up again for as smooth a transition as possible?
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing it, because it's something that not enough founders talk about, right? It kind of like has like a stigma or certain like feelings associated with it. And it is a really challenging thing to go through, especially if you were friends beforehand. Like there could be implications where it feels like, oh, I'm losing a business partner, I'm losing a friend, the business is losing these pieces. And yet, if we can enter into it with, courageousness, vulnerability, then I think there is a world where we can separate well and do so that preserves the relationship and the business. And so, there's several packages that I offer whenever I work with teams. And one of them is this thing called Stabilize or Split, which is like a month-long intensive, because many teams come to me being like, hey, Matt, like, I don't know if we can make this work or not. And what I do know is I'm about at my wit's end. And so we have like this 1 month sprint to really answer that question. The thing that I've seen over and over again is that this question is deeply personal. I've had teams that I've worked with where I've been blown away because they've made so much progress. We get to the end of that engagement and they say, Matt, I'm done. I'm past my line. And I think there's a desire maybe to end well and some other things that factor into it. But more or less, I've, on the outside looking in, been wrong about the assessment, about the viability of the partnership. And I've been wrong on the other side too, where I've seen teams that I'm like, listen, you guys need to break up immediately. Like, this is not sustainable. There's like a lot of contentment, or not contentment, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, like all these like really, really challenging behaviors. And they'll keep pushing through for the next few years. And so it's highly variable. But I think the most important piece is, again, is there a way that we can enter this conversation with integrity and courage, rather than trying to continue avoiding it? Because then ideally we have several, it's not one conversation, but it's starting the conversation that we have multiple times in order to figure out what is the best path for all parties involved.
Mm-hmm. And of course, where things start to get complicated is often, the decision has been made and now the money implications start to come up. And of course, the lawyers in the room would tell you, well, you should have invested in your shareholders agreement and whatnot up front. And, there's some truth to that. Some of that stuff can be cut and dry, but, often it's not. And there's some negotiations that have to take place. The company has to get valued if you're buying each other out, or if you're not buying each other out, then, how the money flows through the business has to get sorted out. And I've found that that can be a place where even a relationship that is going into that conversation healthy can start to degrade fairly quickly. Any advice for, how to get through that portion of the discussion or the process?
Well, 100%. I think that's one of the more difficult parts, because at least what I've seen is that, um, what's interesting, I guess I've seen, how do you say this? Like companies get different valuations while looking at the same information, just because they both had their own parties come in, and oddly enough, and perhaps not so surprisingly, they adopted the perspective of the individual who hired them. And so I think much like kind of divorce, once the attorneys and other folks get involved, it can become inherently more of a contentious process. And so I think that introduces an element of chaos that's really, really challenging. My advice, and I'm curious to hear how this lands for you, or like what you disagree with, just based on your expertise. But I think it's best in an ideal world to I don't know if this makes sense, but kind of wait as long as you can before you bring in some of those final perspectives. And talk through, in an ideal world, talk through those different scenarios of well, what happens if this valuation comes back, and how would you feel if you didn't get what you wanted here, and are there other paths, other ways that we can be creative with this arrangement to still kind of make it make sense, even though it's going to be painful for both of us.
Yeah, that tracks with just sort of how our process went. And again, that might be just our unique context and situation. We were kind of well suited to have those discussions, but we did sort of get all the way to basically negotiating everything that needed to be negotiating and figuring out the transition plan before any of those people got looped in. And to your point, it is sort of a fundamentally adversarial conversation when you get there. I mean, you enter a negotiation, and then it is in your best interest, or in every party's best interest, to have that dynamic be very, very different. And there's still an element of that's at play when you're having those conversations face to face, but it's a little bit harder for it to become contentious in that situation.
Yeah, I think the more connection that you can maintain, the better. And I think that could be a general rule across co-founding teams, whether or not they're in this situation, but especially here, if you're able to stay connected and work your way through it, that's obviously better than, I don't know. Well, yeah. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree with that. I think to the extent that you can work through a lot of that stuff together, before bringing those folks in, I think that is the right policy. And while we're on the subject, one of the things that I recount when we were sort of in the heat of that discussion, and when I first sort of got the news, I guess, is how emotional that was. And as I processed those emotions, how little of it had to do with the business. There was certainly some fear and uncertainty and doubt about what things would look like in the future without that person in the business. And just because I had never imagined what the business would be like without them around, and that uncertainty, weighed on me and created some emotion. And, there was, but ultimately, it wasn't really about that. It wasn't about the money. The thing that was most difficult was grieving the relationship, and this notion that as much as I'm probably going to be friends with this person for the rest of my life, our relationship will never be the same after this. It will, and we'll probably never spend as much time talking as we do right now running this business. And, as most adult friends do, they start families and they do other things, and you don't talk to each other a whole lot. And I think when I was able to process the emotions, that was the thing that was actually most emotional about the whole thing. Was I was grieving the loss of my relationship with my co-founder, and to some degree part of the vision for the business as well that we had together, that I knew was going to have to change after he was gone. And I think that's important, because there were times when I felt that clouding my judgment when we were trying to work on things that were unrelated, and I had to constantly be pulling on that thread to be like, hey, what's really going on here? What am I really feeling? And it's amazing how much of the emotion was actually just about the relationship and not about the business itself.
Yeah, I so appreciate your awareness of the emotions that were coming up and how it was impacting, some of the other tactical bits that still had to move forward. Because as you were talking, I felt, and I still feel like some sadness and some hurt. And the fact that you named grief to me feels so important, because I think especially as founders and entrepreneurs, there's a desire, to, maybe intellectualize or kind of bypass some of the emotional dynamics and say, oh, it's all about business or whatever. But you're speaking to the truth that we are fundamentally human, and the people that we partner with, we often know for a long time and or get to know intimately over a period of years. And so there is a real loss that you experience personally and professionally. And I think the courage to enter that grief with eyes and heart open can absolutely help the outcome go more effectively, versus whenever we shut ourselves off of that, that's whenever a lot of these negative kind of power grabs, money grabs, whatever the case may be, can really start to fester.
I'll also note that I think there's some insecurity that can come up on both sides of the equation, right? So like if you're the founder that is staying in the business and somebody else is leaving, I think for me, there were these notions of like, I'm not good enough, I didn't meet their expectations, the business isn't good enough, whatever, like these kinds of insecurities can bubble up and then manifest themselves in really ugly ways if they're not managed properly. And I think from the other side, there can be a lot of guilt, about feeling like I'm abandoning this person, I'm giving up, I'm not following through, whatever the case might be. And, we had thankfully open discussions about how we're feeling about these things on both sides. We're able to work through them. But I think it's important to note that like just the act of following through with something like this can raise a lot of things in each co-founder that may not be apparent on the surface, but driving a lot of like really strange behavior as you get into the heat of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well articulated. That because I guess this goes full circle to part of what you were saying before, that doing the emotional work of disentangling your identity from your business is hard, right? Because this is something that you live and breathe. And so in a moment like this, where there's kind of an injury or pain or hurt, it doesn't just stay isolated to one part of your being. It actually is impacting you kind of across the board.
So I know we've talked, quite a bit about this, and we're coming up on time. Before we wrap, for those that want to learn more about you, read your book, maybe consume some of these resources, where should we send them in the show notes so they can go deeper on this topic?
Yeah, so you can find me online at cofounderclarity.com. If you're interested in the book, you can find it there, and there's some additional free tools and stuff. But if you want to jump right into the book, which has several different free resources attached to it, you can find that on Amazon. So you can we'll send them that link. And then also, if you Google co-founder coaching, co-founder therapy, or the co-founder effect, it all should come up.
Awesome. And we'll have links to all that stuff in the show notes. With all of that, Matt, do you have any final words of advice for those listening who want to improve their relationships with their business partners?
If I could give one piece of advice, I think it would be to take this relationship seriously, and in particular, the threat of emotional debt. It's something that we've kind of hit on in various moments today, but the compounding effect of those small moments of misalignment or frustration do erode the relationship between co-founding teams, erodes their trust, erodes the ability to communicate. And so more and more, I think if we follow what you and I have outlined today of containing the conversation and having the courage to actually go through a clearing conversation together, I think that is the antidote that will lead to the best possible outcome for the individuals and teams involved.
Wise words indeed. Matt, I appreciate you making the time to come on the show, and I hope that everyone listening benefited from it and reaches out to consume more of your content, because it's great stuff. So thanks so much, man.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.